Hey, welcome back. First video of Being in Time. And we're going to look at the introduction today, which is, I think, titled The Exposition of the Question of the Meaning of Being. And it's phrases like that that you need to start getting used to, because that's the way Heidegger rolls. And yeah, you just gotta deal with it. The first part then of interest, I think, for us is what's called the question of being. So Heidegger discusses this, and he talks about being as something that has been forgotten, and not just forgotten, but considered even superfluous these days. So something we don't even really need to think about. And there are kind of three reasons for this, or three, say, arguments against Heidegger's quest for being, quest to understand being. And the first is that being is the most universal concept. It's kind of like, you think about beings. You have individual beings, then you have, say, like a species, or say an individual being which is part of a species, which is part of a genus, and you can build your way up, and the set which encloses all of those, which encloses everything, the greatest set possible, which encapsulates everything, will be being, as in like capital B being. Which is to say that everything that exists participates, or in some way, in this most universal of concepts, being. And so because of this, it doesn't really give us any information. It's just too general. So it ought to be, that's one reason why it has been ignored. And Heidegger responds to that point by saying, even though it is the most universal and the most general, it's not necessarily the most clearly understood, and we still need to direct our attention towards it. Second thing is that the concept of being is indefinable, which is another reason why we might not need, or we might think that we don't need to study being. It's indefinable just by what it is. It's nothing in particular. It's everything. And Heidegger responds to this by saying, well, that only means that being is not a being itself. It's not a particular being itself, and therefore it can't be defined by attributes in the same way that beings can. The particular beings can. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't investigate it. The fact that it's indefinable, it doesn't mean we shouldn't investigate it. It just means that it's going to require an investigation that's different from the way we investigate particular beings. And the third reason why it's kind of been ignored up till Heidegger is that being is a self-evident concept. We don't need to have an investigation of being. We already kind of know what it is. It's just everything. It's everything that exists has being, or is its existence there, right? We don't need an investigation of it. It's self-evident. And Heidegger's response to this is that even though we all have some intuitive understanding of being, we don't know it conceptually. And he calls this intuitive understanding pre-ontological. We have a pre-ontological understanding of being, but we don't really know what it is. And that's why the question of being is important. So then he asks, what is a questioning? And he says there are three elements to a questioning. The first is it's an inquiry about something. Therefore, it must have some preconception about what is being sought. In this case, being. Right? So it's an inquiry, but therefore we must have some preconceived notions about it, or we wouldn't even be able to begin to investigate being. The second element is that it involves the interrogation of some entity or body of evidence. And this is kind of important, and we'll look at it in a little bit more detail in a minute, but the idea is that since being, this is going to be tricky, because we're always talking about being like capital B being of everything, being in itself, versus small b being, which is a particular being, an entity, if you like. So anyway, just be aware of that. There are two beings going on here, and I'll try and separate them where I can. I don't want to deviate too far from using the terminology that Heidegger uses either, though. So I don't want to replace his words with other words. I want to keep using his lexicon. So yeah, just be aware that that's going on. There are two beings here. And so anyway, let me just go back to the second element. It involves the interrogation of some entity or body of evidence. So since being, capital B being in itself, is always the being of beings, it's always the being of a particular being. It's never just standalone on its own. It's not something we can just see floating around out there. It always manifests itself through a particular being. Since that's the case, then it is beings, small b, particular beings, specific beings, which will therefore be interrogated. So it always involves the interrogation of particular beings. And the third element, it ends in a conclusion, the discovery. In this case, the meaning of being. Cool. So I've already used quite a bit of jargon, and two of the well, actually I haven't. All I've done is talk about being. But there are two terms in particular which you must come to grips with if you're going to read through being in time. The first is ontological, and the second is ontic. And so ontological just means pertaining to being itself, that capital B being in general. Another way another word we could perhaps substitute there is existence, just existence itself. And a way to think about this then is ontological means that, or refers to, that in which every being participates just by existing. So if you're thinking about something, this book it exists. That's what we're looking at. That is, we're looking at what it means for something to be, for something to exist, and that's what ontological drives at. As opposed to ontic, which is the particular details of individual beings, of individual entities. And that's another word you can probably harmlessly substitute for small b beings, for small b being. And this is often the world described by science. Science investigates this kind of at the ontic level. So the next section I want to draw your attention to is the ontological priority of the question of being and the ontic priority of the question of being. So just to take that first part, the ontological priority of this investigation, why is it so important? Well, what we're aiming at here is not just, is to quote Being in Time, quote Heidegger, it's the a priori condition of the possibility of the sciences, and also the ontologies which precede the ontic sciences and found them. And so basically all that's saying is that the question of being has an ontological priority, and that it's deeper than entities. It's deeper than small b being. We're looking at things that ground those particular entities. And the ontic priority then, so what's this aspect, the ontic priority of the question of being? That turns out to be Dasein, which I think I mentioned in the opening video, is Dasein's another word for human being, but not just humans like an anthropological in an anthropological sense, human being as in the existence of human beings, the being of human beings. So Dasein is Heidegger's word to describe the being of the human being. And it may sound like just creating words for the sake of creating words, but I'm not sure if I mentioned this before. He wants to distance himself from all philosophy that came before him, in which the human being and human existence and the human life already carries with it a whole bunch of preconceptions and presuppositions and really metaphysical and epistemological baggage. He wants to jettison all of that and start afresh with this kind of untainted idea of what it means for humans to exist. And so that one way to do that is to make a clean break through an entirely new word, new phrase. So Dasein, anytime I use the word Dasein, it's just referring to humans, but from an ontological perspective. Okay. So the ontic priority. So Heidegger says Dasein is ontically distinguished because in its being it is concerned about its very being. So the kind of ontic aspect of this investigation will arise through the fact that we're going to have to study being through an ontic presence, which is Dasein. And why is Dasein? Why do we need this ontic? Why are we going to get to being through this ontic level, which is Dasein? The reason is because Dasein is concerned about its own being, about its own existence. And it's concerned about it just in the fact that it exists. In our very being, in the essence of who and what we are, we're concerned about our existence in a way that no other ontic entity is. If you think about anything else around us, even to the extent of animals, certain animals, most animals, obviously things, tables, chairs, inanimate objects, plants, and many animals, they're not concerned about their existence because they just lack whatever it is that makes us distinct from them. Consciousness or rationality, whatever you want to attribute it to. But because of that, because we're concerned in our very being about our being, we are ontically distinguished, and because of that, we're going to use, or Heidegger's going to use Dasein as kind of an entry point into being in itself, being I don't mean being in itself as in Sartre's being in itself either. Being a general, this general category of being. So Dasein has a relation to being and is disclosed to itself with and through its being. In other words, Dasein is ontological in its being. Okay, so that's why, that's where this notion of the ontic priority of the question of being comes from. And there are three kind of elements to Dasein's priority that Heidegger briefly mentions. One is its ontic priority, which is that it's defined in its ontic being by existence. I just looked at that. There's also an ontological dimension, because Dasein is fundamentally ontological in its being. Again, in a way that no other object or no other entity is. And it's also ontic ontological. And that means that Dasein is capable of an understanding of the being of beings unlike itself. And that is the other kind of aspect to Dasein's priority, to the ontic priority of Dasein. So with that done, there are a couple of other terms I just want to mention, which may come up as we go through being and time. The first is Existenz, which is in German, I think it's spelled Existenz, so like Existenz, if you like. And this is all this is it refers to the being to which Dasein relates. So the way I think about this is just like it's just another way, kind of way of getting into being in general, that capital B being. It relates to that same level, if you like. And related to that word, existence, existenz, is also existential. And so existential, for Heidegger, is the structure of being itself. So if we're talking about something that's existential, we're talking about the structure of being itself. It's in where we're at that deeper level of understanding, below the ontic. And kind of opposed to this is the idea of this existential understanding. And this one is Existentiell. So like if I pronounce it, emphasizing the difference, it's existential understanding. And this is the understanding by which Dasein comes to terms with the question of existence always only through ontic existence itself. So again, it's a reference to that ontic level through which we have to go in order to appreciate or come to in order to come to an existential understanding, which is that deeper level of being, existence, existenz. Yeah. So you can kind of think of it like this, I guess. You've got existence and ontic, and kind of matching each of those at existence. The level of existence, we have existential, which is relating to that structure of being itself. And then the ontic level, we have an existential understanding. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Sounds much more complicated when I'm trying to say it than when I'm thinking about it. Okay, anyway, phenomenology is the next section, and very briefly, what is phenomenology? Phenomenology is it's an approach to originally to consciousness, which was really first described, I guess, originally by Edmund Husserl. And what it is it's a systematic reflection on the structures of consciousness, but on those structures as experienced from a first-person perspective, first-person point of view. So that's kind of a definition, a reflection on the structures of consciousness as experienced from a first-person perspective and the phenomena that appear therein. And basically all it means is it investigates consciousness by including the way that we view the world, the way that we see the world, and the way that the world appears to us, and treating that as kind of meaningful and significant and real, I guess. Using, embracing, I guess, the fact that we are embodied and we have a perspective on the world, and the world appears in a certain way, or even though the world appears the way it does because of our unique perspective, our unique senses. For example, our sensory apparatus is constructed in such a way that the world appears to us the way it does. Even though that's the case, phenomenology treats that as something valid and something which we need to incorporate into our understanding of the world and our relation to the world and our own existence, as opposed to something like the Cartesian/scientific approach, which treats the world as kind of objects out there that relate to, or interacting with each other through cause and law, through causal laws, and so that's kind of the two opposites, I guess, the way I think about it anyway, phenomenology and the scientific Cartesian approach. And in a way, really, all phenomenology does is it includes human perspective and human experience as something genuinely valid and something meaningful. Whereas science, obviously, it deliberately works to exclude any human perspective, any human bias, is what a scientist would say, right? We don't want to have we don't want our theories or our calculations hindered by a perspective, by a lived experience, which may be different for different people even. And so so science wants to kind of abstract out from lived experience. Phenomenology wants to get into it and embrace it and get in the mud with it, and roll around in it and see really what is life like. What are these things as they appear to us, not as they really are, whatever that might mean, whereas science does the exact opposite and tries to see the world as it really is, without any human kind of bias or perspectival variances. Which is not to criticize science, of course, because in science that's exactly what you do need. You do need a when you're devising theories or working on calculations, you don't want lived experience is not relevant, and it is unhelpful to what you're trying to do. If you're trying to launch a satellite so that it goes into orbit around Earth, you need to have that kind of abstract level of analysis It's just that we don't want that abstract level of analysis in every endeavor that we do, right? So when we're talking about human existence or being or the world, actually, in any sense of the way we relate to it, or how it appears to us, or what it means for us, or its significance, or the values that it might have, the values that we might have, then science is going to be a hindrance, and we want rather a phenomenological approach which embraces that unique perspective we have. Whoa, okay, so that's a lot of waffling on phenomenology. Hopefully that's clear. Man, I wrote like 2 sentences. Okay, so anyway, so that's kind of briefly what phenomenology is. Heidegger's phenomenology differs from Husserl's in a couple of ways. So he says Husserl treated consciousness as the object of phenomenology, the what of phenomenology. Phenomenology is, for Husserl, a study of consciousness. And Heidegger rejects the idea that phenomenology has any object. Rather, it is a how, it's a method of philosophical research, not the what of the content of such research. That's the first way he thinks his phenomenology differs from Husserl's. The second is that Husserl has this thing called the phenomenological reduction, which was basically involved bracketing off distracting things that might distract or lead us astray in our investigations, in our philosophizing, such as things in the world, because he's focused on consciousness and the structures of consciousness. So Husserl thought things in the world, they distract us from that. They present obstacles to us trying to understand consciousness purely, if you like. But for Heidegger, that phenomenological reduction is unnecessary, and it's even missing the point, because being, which is what Heidegger is looking at, being is always the being of beings. So we need to go directly to those beings, that ontic level, those individual entities, in order to understand being in general. Big, capital B, being. And not only this, but Dasein's being in the world, the way that Dasein exists, its way of being, as a being concerned with other beings, is not an optional add-on. It's not something we can adopt and suspend at will. Dasein is necessarily and fundamentally in the world. So the point of that is that that's just part of our being. We are in the world. It's not something we can't abstract from that and look at what it means to exist purely, if you like. If you take away the world, you take away Dasein. The two kind of come together. And so any kind of phenomenological reduction in the Husserlian sense, which brackets off that world in order to understand, say, Dasein itself, it defeats the purpose, because the two come together. There is no separating the world from Dasein. We are fundamentally in the world. So Heidegger then has he goes through a little etymological analysis of the word phenomenology, and he says phenomenon, the first part of that word, has 3 meanings. One, it's as semblance, which is a showing as a thing it is not. So kind of something that appears to us a certain way, but that's not what it really is. He calls that a semblance. The second type of phenomenon, I guess, is appearance. And an appearance is something which does not show itself directly, but it announces itself through another thing which does show itself. And the example here is like a symptom of a disease. The disease doesn't show itself directly, but it kind of announces itself through this symptom, which does show itself directly. Another kind of appearance is something which never shows itself. And an example of this is Kant's thing in itself. And the third type of phenomenon Heidegger just calls phenomenon, and this is a self-showing. And it refers to that which ordinarily, unthematically shows itself in the appearance, but which can be brought thematically to show itself. And all that means is that something which, in say a perception you might have, there's something in that perception which is not explicit, something that's not obvious, something that's not there, but it's there nonetheless, even though it doesn't show itself. And even though it's unthematic, it's not explicitly there, it's not explicitly revealed, it can be explicitly revealed. And a good example of this is Kant's idea of space and time. So for Kant, space and time weren't things that were out there in the world, separate from us. We didn't, so space and time were categories of our own perception, of consciousness, which means that rather than being out there, they're things that we bring with us when we perceive anything. Anytime we perceive anything, we perceive it in space and in time, not because those space and time, or things, not because things in the world occur in space and time, but because that's part of our viewing apparatus, our perceiving apparatus. It's conditioned in such a way that when we look at anything, when we perceive anything, we just by virtue of the way our consciousness is and the way it works, we perceive things in space and in time. So it's something we bring to the world, not something that exhibits itself in the world. So space and time then, it's ordinarily, it's unthematically, it's not explicit around us. We can't see space and we can't see time, but these things can be brought to thematic, they can be brought to thematic awareness, I guess, through an investigation of them, through a deliberate study, like the way that Kant undertook. And of course, another example of this phenomenon is being. Being is another kind of something. It's something which is there all the time. It's in everything we see, in every perception we have, but it's something which is there unthematically. We normally don't see it, and to bring it out, we have to go to some efforts. We have to investigate the meaning of being, which is what Heidegger's doing. And so the second half of that word logos means discourse, which Heidegger says means to let be seen. So combining those two, phenomenon and logos, phenomenology, therefore means to, brace yourself for this, let what shows itself be seen from itself, just as it shows itself from itself. Which is a classic Heidegger definition. But I think if you break it down, it's pretty simple. Let what shows itself be seen from itself. Just to see things the way they present themselves to us. See things like that, the way I was talking about before, phenomenologically, as opposed to scientifically. Not trying to find a real, what something really is, rather letting it reveal itself to us the way that it naturally does, and then proceeding from there, just as it shows itself from itself. So in this sense, phenomenology lets the thing which is always covered up be seen. So it's that, letting whatever is unthematically normally, letting it come to thematic awareness. Because of that, because that's what phenomenology is, ontology is possible only as phenomenology. And that's kind of where Heidegger was leading this whole time. Ontology is possible only as phenomenology. The only way we can get to being is only able to be investigated through phenomenology, because phenomenology is that approach which lets something appear, something which is ordinarily unthematic in its presence. It's ordinarily unexplicit, but phenomenology lets that thing appear as it really is. And being is the kind of thing which is ordinarily unexplicit, unthematic. And so phenomenology is perfectly suited to ontology. Okay, so that's the bulk of the introduction. The last little thing I want to mention is Heidegger gives an outline of his what being and time is supposed to be, his plan, his grand plan. And it's an incomplete plan. He never finished he never completed what he wanted to complete with being and time. Originally there were supposed to be two parts to it, first of all. And the first part 1, was to be the interpretation of Dasein as care on the basis of temporality, and the explication of time as the transcendental horizon of the question of being. So, essentially there are 3 parts to the first part. There's the analysis of Dasein and temporality, and time and being. Those are the 3 parts. Heidegger finished the first 2, and they are in being and time. So being and time is the first 2 sections of part 1. The interpretation of Dasein as care, which we'll look at, and also the way that's founded on temporality. That's also in being and time. But the explication of time as the horizon of the question of being, that was supposed to be in that 3rd section, time and being, never written. There are a whole bunch of reasons, or a whole bunch of theories about why it never got written, which I'm not going to weigh in on, basically, because I don't know. But actually there is a good book. It's tough to read, but it's worth it if you want to learn anything about this. It's Heidegger's Temporal Idealism. It's written by William Blattner, who's the guy who wrote one of those commentaries on being and time I mentioned in the last video. It's a little bit tough going. Definitely make sure you get through being and time first before you tackle that. But yeah, he talks about he has an opinion on why Heidegger never finished being and time the way he originally planned on doing. And the second part was to be the phenomenological destruction of the history of ontology, following the guideline of the problem of temporality. Which probably just sounds like a whole bunch of words stuck together and thrown at you. But this was to be in three sections as well. The first one was to look at Kant as a preliminary stage of a problem of temporality, then Descartes and the ontological foundation of his cogito sum, and medieval ontology in the problem of the res cogitans. I don't know, pronunciation, you know. And Aristotle's treatise on time. That's the third section. So anyway, that was the original outline. He did. Yeah, if you read different people, that people have different thoughts on this. Some say that he actually finished most of what he planned, but not in the same format. So he has some works on Kant and temporality and Descartes, and he talks about Aristotle in other places. But it certainly never got finished in the way that he planned it. And I don't think he ever really talked about time and being. That's the third section of the first part. And if you believe William Blattner, it's because Heidegger's a temporal idealist and realized that it was never going to work. He could never found, he could never get through kind of to being through temporality. So he abandoned the project. But Heidegger never said he abandoned it. Heidegger never said it was. He never said his work in being and time was wrong, or it went down a path that was wrong. He always endorsed everything he wrote. So yeah, it's why did he never finish it the way he planned? No one really knows. But anyway, enough waffling. That's the first video. Hopefully that's a little bit helpful. I'll see you for the second video where we'll look at chapter 1. Till then.